Good afternoon, and thank you for attending this session as the Cleveland Foundation annual meeting presented by KeyBank continues. I am India Pierce-Lee, Senior Vice President for Program at the Cleveland Foundation. I am pleased to present this breakout session on understanding systemic racism with my colleague, Courtenay Barton, Program Director for Arts and Culture and Racial Equity Initiatives at the Cleveland Foundation. Today, Courtenay will present a few data points that reflect how systemic racism is affecting Black and Brown individuals in our community. As we are learning through COVID, so many issues we have all collectively been working on for decades have come to the surface and brought awareness of how these issues are viewed through a racial lens, which many of us have always understood, but it is now being acknowledged. Add to this the senseless murders of so many throughout the country that continue over and over again. We have seen a movement with Black Lives Matters and so many others that are standing up to the racism that unfortunately is too prevalent in our society and being stoked through politics to continue to create fear and even more racial division. We have to stay the course and not get complacent, understanding this work will take time, but I'm optimistic that we can and will make the change that we need for all of our citizens. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions as we go, and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. And now I am proud to turn this over to my colleague, Courtenay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Courtenay Barton, and I'm the Program Director for Arts and Culture and Racial Equity Initiatives at the Cleveland Foundation. And we have some slides for you that we would like to present. Great. So I want to start by acknowledging that talking about racism is really difficult and uncomfortable for many people. So I want to first say that I am so grateful that so many of you are joining us this afternoon for this conversation. To call 2020 a tumultuous year would be an understatement. But I want to start by drawing your attention to some news from January of this year that I honestly don't think enough people noticed. So, unfortunately, this January, according to a Bloomberg City Lab report on metropolitan area livability, Cleveland was named the worst city in the country for Black women. Now, there has been a persistent and often negative public narrative around Cleveland that in many ways is unproductive to play into. But this is not about perception. This is about data. This is about the lived experiences of thousands of Black women and their families that live here, and it is based on public information about Black women and our outcomes around health and income and other life circumstances. Now, I'm sure that many people hearing this conclusion might be thinking that we need to offer some solutions-oriented programming for Black women. Maybe health education and access programs and services, or maybe job training programs. But this same report included a finding that may shock some of you, and I will read it word for word because it is critical. According to the Status of Black Women in the United States report, produced by the Institute for Women's Policy Research, Black women overall saw their median annual earnings decline by 5% between 2004 and 2014, despite the fact that the share of Black women with at least a bachelor's degree increased by 23.9% in that same time period. Now let's dig into this fact because it's certainly surprising. It was surprising to me, and it's counterintuitive. The dominant public narrative embedded in American society is that if you get an education, especially a higher education, you will earn a better living and you will have a better life. And this is the message that has been communicated in schools. It's the messaging and the services to match that have been offered by nonprofit organizations and funded by philanthropy. And to be clear, that's not a bad thing. And in many ways, it has been successful. Black women especially have responded to this narrative, increasing bachelor's degree attainment by nearly a quarter in a decade. But for Black women, the narrative turned out to be false because higher income and the better life understood to correlate to this income did not follow. And it's not as though income merely stagnated or stayed the same for Black women. It actually declined. And I would like to annotate this by saying, let's compound that declining income with the student loan debt that many Black women surely incurred to get this education. And let's factor in inflation. Black women, these women mentioned in this study, according to the public understanding, made the right choice in pursuing higher education, but it was not met with the promised outcomes. This conversation is entitled Understanding Systemic Racism, with emphasis on systemic, because we aren't just going to talk about individual choices, personal choices like these Black women that decided to go get degrees in the last 15 years or so. Systemic issues are the ones that cause their income to decline at the same time. But before we dig into that, I think we need to have a basis of good definition. So let's get a definition of what systemic racism is specifically. Systemic is related to systems, and a system is defined as a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnecting network. One of the examples in this definition that I found on Google is the way organs of the body connect and work together. Racism. Racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized, pushed to the margins, and the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. I want to draw your attention to language like marginalized, language like inferior or superiority. When you use words like this, you are describing a relationship of power. Somebody who is thought to occupy a superior position has more power than somebody who is thought to occupy an inferior or marginalized position. So, taken together, when we are talking about systemic racism, we are talking about the ways that components of a social system create or enforce a power dynamic on the basis of race. We are not talking about prejudice or bias or simple dislike or being mean to someone on the basis of race. And we are not discussing being kinder or more tolerant or empathetic for people. That all falls under an umbrella that we can call interpersonal racism, and those discussions are important and have their place, but today we are focusing on systems of power. How can we know that systemic racism exists? Well, like this quote from Glenn Harris, pictured here on the slide, we can know this by examining evidence to see if racisms are interacting in a way, or excuse me, if systems are interacting in a way that creates or enforces unbalanced power dynamics on the basis of race. So that's what we are going to do. In his intro, Ron Richard alluded to this, but in 2019, Cleveland was found to be the 9th most segregated city in the nation based on census data. Please make note of the color patterns on this map if you have your visuals on. The fuchsia, which is concentrated at the center, represents areas where 80% or more of the residents are Black. The blue, which is primarily along the borders, represent places where 80% or more of the residents are white. And the lavender areas, which are kind of interspersed in between, represent areas where no one racial group is 80% or more of the population. This is what is called in policy circles hyper-segregation. And sometimes people assume residential segregation, like depicted on this slide, is the result of people choosing to live in close proximity to people of the same race. But we will see that it is in fact the result of interaction of laws and policies. It's the result of systems. One such policy, redlining, also referenced by Ron in his intro. Redlining was a practice that was instigated by the federal government in the 1930s and 40s. The Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation analyzed city maps, many of these cities were actually pretty racially mixed at this point. They drew red lines, literal red lines on the maps, around any neighborhood that contained what they considered to be a concentration of Black residents, and then systematically denied mortgage financing for properties in those areas. Up to that point, Cleveland was one of those residentially mixed cities. But then these maps were drawn, and suddenly, with the literal stroke of a pen, real estate in those neighborhoods became a bad investment. So people would have wanted to leave those neighborhoods. As you can imagine, Black people and white people, renters and homeowners alike, because anyone who wants to buy a home, first, likely needs a mortgage in order to buy that home, and two, wants it to have the greatest possible property value. And anyone who needed to rent a home would not want to rent a home in a place where a landlord couldn't even get a mortgage loan to maintain their property. But neighborhood associations and real estate developers in areas that weren't redlined and in local suburbs began to issue racially restrictive covenants that prevented what they considered undesirable people from moving in, either as renters or owners. And undesirable was understood to be code language for Black. Covenants took the form of clauses inserted into property titles that prohibited the sale or rental to undesirable people. And all of this was well known at the time. It wasn't a secret, as this 1947 cover story from the Cleveland Call and Post indicates. At the same time, unencumbered by obstacles like covenants, white residents moved out of those redline neighborhoods and they bought homes in the suburbs. And we know that buying a home and accumulating home equity is the greatest source of wealth, home and generational wealth in the United States. So to recap, with just 2 slides, we have discussed the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation representing the federal government, financial systems. We have discussed local governments and private homeowners and real estate developers refusing to sell or rent to Black residents. That's at least 4 systems that interacted to create residential segregation that has persisted to this day. So people live apart. But what's that got to do with occupying an inferior or superior power position based on race? Well, take a look at this. This is a map of the infant mortality rate in Cleveland. Note how it resembles the map of residential segregation we looked at earlier. Some neighborhoods in Cleveland, like Kinsman, have infant mortality rates that are 22 out of 1,000. That's on par with North Korea. White babies simply do not die at these rates. And you should know, First Year Cleveland has found that most of the Black women who will lose an infant before the child turns 1 year of age completed all of their prenatal doctor visits and either self-paid for their care or had employer-sponsored health insurance plans. That is to say, they made the right choices, they had access to health care. And it is also known that across this country, a Black woman with a PhD is more likely to lose an infant than a white woman who dropped out of high school. There is literally not enough education in the world that a Black woman can get that will guarantee a difference in her child's chance of survival. Take a look at this next map. This is a map of the poverty rate in Cuyahoga County. The darker areas have higher poverty rates than the lighter shaded areas. The color pattern resembles the one of residential segregation we looked at a moment ago, and in fact, the darker red areas exhibit a similar pattern to the infant mortality map. And it resembles the residential segregation map. We could say we need to work on programs to help people in these neighborhoods, but we also discussed at the outset that Black women's income declined as education increased. And the next one, just to drive this point home, people who live less than 2 miles apart have a 23-year difference in life expectancy. This is simply unjust. And all of these maps resemble the map of redlining. It's not a coincidence. It's the predictable result of systemic racism. In the 1940s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew maps like the one on the right, and Black people today are dealing with the ugly consequences of that decision. There may likely have been interpersonal racism at play when the policies and systems and structures that led to this were enacted, but the only thing that is necessary to keep that same old system running and to produce these disparities is to do the same things that we have been doing in the last several decades, unexamined and unchallenged. Every sector has a role to play in dismantling systemic racism, and that includes philanthropy. For our part at the Cleveland Foundation, we understand that we must first name the fact that funding disparities exist in our sector before we can do our part to end them. In foundation giving across the country, giving to organizations specifically led by people of color to serve their communities has fallen to no more than 8% of all grants given. And our country is right now in a state of acute crisis with regard to the Black community specifically. So we have to ask ourselves what we plan to do about all of this. If I may quote Dr. Martin Luther King, we are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In the face of everything we have experienced in this past year, this long pandemic, Black people disproportionately working in jobs that are deemed essential now that it's a pandemic, but were previously referred to as minimum wage, that have been seeing their requests for hazard pay and health benefits and rent relief and decarceration and expanded digital access for remote learning and personal protective equipment to stem the devastating effects of this incurable contagion denied. The anger and grief in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and Tony McDade, and very recently in the wake of the shooting of Jacob Blake. The New York Times found that the current movement for Black lives is the largest movement in United States history. So think about that. That makes it larger than the civil rights movement. It makes it larger than the movement for independence from Great Britain. By all indicators, we are living in the least racially equitable moment in this country's history since the 1960s. As a graduate student, I wrote a thesis about what philanthropy should be doing in order to help achieve racial equity being defined as a state in which one's race does not have a correlation to one's life outcomes. And I read a lot of material in the field and a lot of historic material, including about the Cleveland Foundation. And one thing that I found that was very interesting, buried in the founding resolution of the foundation, that I don't think a lot of people really paid attention to previously, really stood out to me. In 1914, the Cleveland Foundation's founding resolution vowed to support the mental, moral, and physical improvement of the inhabitants of the city of Cleveland as now or hereafter constituted, regardless of race, color, or creed. Now, I don't think that this stood out to people because looking back more than 100 years, this looks like standard 21st century non-discrimination language, but 1914 was only 18 years after the US Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation on the basis of race was legal. And if you've read anything written by Ibram X. Kendi, which I highly recommend, he notes that Plessy versus Ferguson really only blessed the way of life that had been already adopted by the vast majority of this country. It was not necessary to open one's doors or provide equal treatment to people without regard to race. It was in fact considered, it was looked down upon in some certain circles, certainly among circles that might have been solicited to contribute to this nascent community trust. But the founders of the Cleveland Foundation thought that it was important to state upfront that they would not discriminate. And we as a foundation today, in 2020, have to ask ourselves, what is it that we are willing to do that is equally as bold in our current context? So this is why today we are announcing the creation of a new fund, the Cleveland Black Futures Fund, which has been created with the intent of providing intentional resources to Black-led social change organizations. We are operating off of the principle that the people closest to the problem are often closest to the solution. We also know that grants to Black-led organizations have declined in the last 30 years, which, looking back, is exactly when racial disparities actually began to widen. Collectively, nonprofits and philanthropy and really our whole society took our foot off the gas of achieving racial equity, and now's the time to reverse that. This fund has been seeded with an initial grant of $2.5 million. And I want to make a few things very clear about this fund. Number one, it's a beginning. We recognize that the work that needs to be done will take a very long time, will need us to remain very committed for a very long time, and will require a lot of resources, more than $2.5 million. And to be clear, this is not the only place and the only way that we will support social change with a racial equity lens, including supporting Black-led organizations, but this is a way to keep us more intentional and more accountable. Number two, racism is not a black-white binary issue, but We believe that we must do specific work in specific communities without falling into the ways in which a blanket people of color serving strategy can obscure important issues. And I want you to know that work is underway, and we will be making more announcements soon about what we are doing to serve other specified communities of color with intention as we move forward. And number 3, I know there will be a lot of questions about how this fund will work. How will people be able to access this fund? What will the application process be like? When will grants be made? I have been speaking with many of our nonprofit partners here locally and with colleagues and foundations around the country which are doing very similar work and launching similar funds. And there's still a lot of work that we have to do in order to get up and running. So I want you to consider this announcement of the seeding of the Cleveland Black Futures Fund today just the first of several with regard to information about this fund, and there will be more opportunities for conversation and more information forthcoming, including more interactive webinars to discuss all of this. But today we wanted to make sure people understood the why of why we are doing this. We wanted to let people know that we see what is happening. We hear the calls for change and for justice and for equity. And we know that there are bold and brave leaders in our community who are doing the work. And this is our first step to being better partners and supporters. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to India.
So now we will take questions. You can put in the chat feature. And again, we'll try to answer as many as we can. And there's been questions about sharing these slides as well as the presentations, and those will be available after these sessions. Okay, the first question, is this fund intended to support Black-led organizations specifically?
Yes. I understand that this is perhaps not something that people are used to foundations, specifically the Cleveland Foundation, saying that we are interested specifically in the leadership of the organization. But we are in this instance because we do know that there are inequities in grant making and inequities that have prevented organizations that are led by people of color in general and Black people specifically from accessing grants. And so this is a channel for us to begin to build relationships with Black nonprofit leaders. So yes, it is intended to support Black-led organizations specifically in this instance. And again, we are also committed to and intentional about creating similar opportunities for organizations led by people of color generally that will be rolled out in the very near future.
Can you give some examples of social change organizations you will be funding?
Well, I don't want to jump the gun about, what organizations we will be funding specifically. But what I can say is that we are interested in opening the doors wide and getting to know the work of organizations that we have not supported in the past. Because we also know that people are out there doing the work without necessarily stopping to think and look for funding. In my work at the foundation, specifically in arts and culture, I have met so many amazing and wonderful people, organizational leaders who have been doing work for decades. And when I ask, well, how have you been funding this work up to this point? The answer is like credit cards and bake sales and hope. And they just have not applied for funding. I hope this is the opportunity for us to start relationships with people who are out there doing the work grassroots level on the streets every single day.
Okay. The next one, what are some constructive ways that I can use my emotional reactions when my opinions on racism are challenged?
That's a difficult one. First, take a breath. Take 2, take 3. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about systemic racism today and not interpersonal racism is because sometimes, most of the time, when it comes to actually doing the work, you have to take yourself out of it. As a Black woman, I have to take myself out of it. As a Black woman who works at a foundation, when there are critiques of the way that the organization that I represent has shown up in the community, I have to remember it's not about me. It's about the lives that we need to affect and ultimately save through the work that we are doing. And it can sometimes be really difficult to step back take a deep breath, remove the personal from the conversation, but that's what really has to be done. We see that systems will run as they have been constructed, no matter how you feel, no matter what your intentions are, and that has to be remembered. Let's turn our attention to the systems and dismantle those and get to some better outcomes.
Next question, how would you evaluate the city, county, and state governments in terms of their complicity in this system's racism or their efforts to curb it?
That is a great and really deep question that you could have your own session about government. What I can say is that it is encouraging to see so many municipal, local, county governments naming racism as a specific health issue, which is what this county has recently done, because you can't solve an issue until you name it. And naming it creates accountability. Once you've acknowledged that it exists, you can't pretend that you don't know that it exists. So now what we need to do is move forward and hold our municipal governments accountable. Say, you've named racism as this problem. So what are the specific steps that you're going to take? And I think it takes work, right? Like, we all have to engage. We have to be civically engaged. We have to raise our voices and make sure that our elected officials are accountable.
And I would like to add to that, I sit on the County Citizen Advisory Council on Equity. We're just beginning, but the role is to also look at the policies within the county government, to really look at where these systems across all the areas we talk about: health, education, transportation, housing, economic development, and more, and really dig into those policies that affect our citizens in a way that those policies get changed to end the systemic racism that exists. And I know the city of Cleveland also has a similar committee working on this. But at the end of the day, we have to come together as a community to deal with all of the policies that affect the systems that people have to go through. And I think through COVID, I think people have learned. It's no longer about those people, because people that never had to face those systems now understand and have seen the bureaucracies that exist in those systems. And so we have a lot of work to do. Yeah, we have a lot of work.
Now. It's now, enshrined in official record that racism is a public health issue. So ask your public officials, now that racism is a public health issue, now that it's been acknowledged, what are you planning to do about it?
Okay, the next question, how does Cleveland differ from other cities in terms of a response or reaction to addressing racial equity?
That's a great question. What I can say is that I have been in conversations with community foundations across the country this summer about responses from Minneapolis to Seattle to Syracuse, around the country, many of which are doing similar work in convening, foundation funders, donors, nonprofits, and creating these sorts of intentional opportunities. But I think one of the things that Cleveland has been doing for the last few years that we have to acknowledge is public education about the existence of systemic racism through the Racial Equity Institute. If you haven't done it, sign up for it and do it. It's being offered virtually through Third Space Action Lab. If you have done it, don't forget that anybody who has done it is permitted to observe for free at any time. It is a great reminder of everything that we need to remember. We've just had, 20 minutes and one issue to discuss today. But I think that having a couple of years in which thousands and thousands of Cleveland residents have gone through the Racial Equity Institute has created enough awareness so that we were able right now to have conversations that people weren't ready to have before, because they didn't even have a basic understanding of the existence of systemic racism at the ready. So the preparation work has been done. Now it's time for the rubber to meet the road.
Yep. Next question. How soon do you anticipate the funds being available from the Cleveland Black Futures Fund?
I'm going to ask you to stay tuned for that. We know that it's urgent. The timing is urgent. So we don't plan to linger before we start rolling things out. But I also want to make sure that our plan is thorough before we roll it out. So please expect another webinar this fall with specific information about the rollout of the Cleveland Black Futures Fund. Our
next question, hold on, just move. how can foundations that don't participate financially in the Cleveland Black Futures Fund best align their efforts with the fund, and will there be a way to do that?
That's a really great question. One of the things that I have been exploring by modeling some other sort of joint and aligned funding strategies is the way that perhaps we can put together a learning circle so that we can coordinate efforts, right? So that we can make sure that people are on the same page, even if they're not necessarily giving through the same vehicle. Please be on the lookout for that if you are interested in aligning or perhaps joining a learning circle so that we can share knowledge and information and best practices, which is how I have been, spending my summer aligning with other foundations around the country. Please reach out to us.
Okay, this is a comment. Just wanted to say you're doing a great job, Courtney. So I thought I'd pass that on. The next question, can you give us an example of the organizations and initiatives that you are currently funding or expecting to fund? And how can smaller foundations, hold on, keeps moving here while people are typing in. How can smaller foundations get involved in identifying organizations and initiatives to support?
So again, I don't want to jump the gun about what the fund will support specifically. I think that would be unfair. I don't want to go into it with a preconceived idea of we're going to fund this, this, and this, because I do want to make it a genuine opportunity for organizations that don't already have an existing relationship with the Cleveland Foundation to access funding. With that said, there are so many wonderful organizations that we know that the community is relying upon, especially in the midst of this pandemic, this real crisis situation that we are in. And I've been looking around and seeing about the ways in which foundations have been using funds like these to support work in a broad array of issue areas. And we want this to be open to issue areas as well. So that includes, Black people and immigration, LGBTQ issues, technology, education, health. We are open to hearing from everybody working at the intersection of Black leadership on these issue areas. And what was the second part of the question, India?
See here, this. Okay, that it's moved.
It was about smaller foundations, and was it about?
Yeah, about smaller foundations, yes.
Listening. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But what you got to get out there to do is talk to the people that you are funding and ask them, who aren't we funding that we should be talking to? And talk to your neighbors and talk to your friends and have informational meetings and see what's out there that we don't know is happening that we should know. And we do a lot of that here at the Cleveland Foundation. We will do a lot more when it comes to this fund. Some of you may know, if you work in the arts and culture field, that I also manage the Minority Arts and Education Fund. And the very first thing that we did with the Minority Arts and Education Fund when we adopted a strategy 2 years ago of being intentional about supporting organizations led by people of color was just setting up time for people to come and talk to me. Let's talk, let's get it out on the table. And we learned so much about organizations that have been doing tremendous, wonderful, extraordinary work for years and years. And we've created a lot of relationships, including funding relationships off of that. So foundation people, if you are watching this right now, you got to build the time for the relationship building.
Okay. Next one. Thank you for this presentation. What have you heard from grantees about ways in which they would like community members to support their work and advance racial equity?
So, community members. Well, let me start by saying that one of the things that I hear from grantees all the time is that there are a lot of hoops to jump through to access funding, right? And we ask for a lot of paperwork, and maybe people don't have familiarity with, filling out a grant application. I was a fundraiser for years, so I did it all the time. And I understand everybody doesn't have that familiarity. So one of the things that we have been asked for is just assistance with the process and making it a lower barrier of entry, which is something that I am committed to trying to do. When it comes to community members, and speaking as a community member, getting the word out, lifting up the message, thinking about the space that you occupy. I am a Black woman working in philanthropy. It is my job and my duty and my goal and my desire to represent the community to the foundation and the foundation to the community and to create a true bridge. And I think everybody has the opportunity to create a true bridge in whatever position they occupy. So basically, I'm saying, play your position. If you have access to somebody or something that can be of assistance, deliver the message. And don't underestimate the access to what you have, because everybody's a gatekeeper in some way.
Okay. Next question. Great presentation. How can we emphasize the equity resolution prescription in homes, Black, white, and Latino?
How can we emphasize what is it?
The equity resolution
Ooh.
prescription.
You got to talk about it. You have to talk about it. Definitely talk about it at home. I know that's hard, especially if you have a household or a home where people have very different views, or people just don't know. People don't know. People don't know what they don't know. Find a way to become educated about the issue. One of the things that we want to do after this, the slides will be available. They're annotated. They have sources. Share your sources, discuss them, consider yourself on a learning journey, and do it intentionally, right? Like, I'm not saying you have to set a study time to, discuss a certain article, but don't turn away. Don't turn away from the conversation. And people do turn away from the conversation at home because it's difficult. But if you can't talk about something at home, where else can you talk about it? So.
Okay. Will there be an element on policing and criminal justice issues? So I'll take that one. We are in the process of the foundation of looking at police and criminal justice reform and working to understand the system, one, but we have other partners like Gun Foundation and the Ohio Transformation Fund and many others who have already been working in this space. So we will be working with them to understand where the gaps are in the system and be rolling out something in partnership with all of the other partners on this issue.
I would also just like to say criminal justice is certainly an element of racial equity. Sometimes they get conflated in conversations. We are open to criminal justice specifically with this fund in addition to the other initiatives that India just mentioned, but I want to make sure that we're not conflating it, because I also want to make sure that we are open to imagining what racial justice looks like, what racial equity will look like in this work. As Audre Lorde said, we don't live single issue lives, so we're trying to be open to the issue areas that we will support.
Okay. Who will be making the decisions regarding the grant selection?
Well, grants will be approved by the Cleveland Foundation Board of Trustees, Board of Directors, as usual. We are working to build a mechanism for input and transparency on that process that we will roll out more information about soon. I know that sometimes grant making can be a really opaque process, and we don't want this to be an opaque process. Because it's about building trust, and you can't build trust if you're hiding information. And I'm not trying to hide information right now, but I am trying to give more time for us to discuss this thoroughly, because I think it will be a longer discussion.
Okay. Next one, excellent work presenting today. Is there anything you can share about the ways in which the foundation staff and board are learning about systemic racism?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, all staff were required to participate in the Racial Equity Institute trainings. And anybody who joins the Cleveland Foundation staff is also required to participate. And that really, I think, did spur a learning journey for a lot of people who had never been exposed to things. I studied African American studies. This is an area of passion for me, but I've done that training 3 times myself personally because it's important and powerful. And we are also continuing to provide and make ways for staff to continue that. Anisfield Wolf, which has a session right now, which a lot of you are not in because you're here with us and I appreciate it. The Anisfield Wolf canon, we utilize that in book discussions internally because that is intentionally targeted at creating understanding, breaking down barriers, and that's important in this work as well. And there are other ways in which we are doing it. We continue to seek avenues for professional development. We partnered the Cleveland Foundation with the Gund Foundation and Cuyahoga Arts and Culture to bring Race Forward and grant makers in the arts to Cleveland in order to do a session for grant makers specifically. And there are more ways, and we continue to endeavor to keep ourselves informed because we don't believe that we know everything.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So this next one, is there a goal set for the amount of funding to address the issues in our community through the fund? In other words, do you have sights on the level of funding you like to raise for this fund? And many of our Black-led organizations need $2.5 million just to keep going.
That's real talk. That's absolutely real. I don't have a ceiling on how much I want to raise for this fund because I know that however much I think needs to be raised, we probably need more in order to actually get to racial equity. With that said, we're going to have to make decisions about the size of grants so that we don't run out of money too quickly. We continue to raise when we can continue to keep with this work. But I want to emphasize $2.5 million is not enough to end racial inequity, but it is giving us a good place to start. And we believe that it is a starting point. It is not an end point. We want to raise more. We want to allocate more. But those are discussions that we will have to have as time goes on.
Okay. Well, allocations from the fund include organizations that are not led by minorities, but overwhelmingly, data shows serves a minority population.
The answer to that question is no. We are specifically interested in organizations that are led by Black people for this fund. Again, it's not the only thing that we are going to be doing, but there's a lot of information out there that shows that organizations that are specifically led by people of color, no matter what their outcomes are, no matter how great the work it is that they are doing, are locked out of funding opportunities. So this is an opportunity for us as a foundation to practice some equity, because we know that the outcomes are inequitable. If you happen to lead an organization and you're a Black person, you're locked out of funding opportunities. So that's why we are doing this.
Okay, and our okay, last comment and question. Let me see. Got to find it. Where did it go? Here, I appreciate Courtenay's remarks about the declining investment in Black-run organizations since the 1970s and the parallel growth in disparities. Your "we let our foot off the gas" comment will stick with me. Do you have a sense of how to measure both the decline and the anticipated increase of investments?
The decline. Well, I can tell you this just real quick. We know that the education gap was the lowest in the United States in the late 1980s. It had been cut in half in about less than a 20-year period between the time the Supreme Court ordered the enforcement of desegregation of schools, not between the time that the Supreme Court actually desegregated schools with Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. It actually wasn't until like the 1970s the Supreme Court ordered busing to enforce desegregation. And from that point, it took less than 20 years to cut the education gap in half. That's remarkable. Only 20 years to cut the education gap in half. But when lawsuits were filed to end busing, the education gap began to widen again. It only took us 20 years to cut it in half the first time around. And I'm not saying it's only going to take us 20 years to end disparities now. What I'm saying is that with intentional focus, I hope in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years and 25 years, we will have made remarkable progress.
Okay, we have a lot more questions, so we will find a way to respond to the questions that didn't get answered today. And we'd like to thank you again for attending today's session. We hope you enjoyed the presentation and learned a lot, and hope you can contribute a lot. After this, you will receive an invitation to take a brief community survey, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. So please consider sharing your thoughts on today's event, as well as your vision for a more equitable, racially aware Greater Cleveland. Also, at this time, I would be remiss if I didn't remind people that to fill out the census, September 30th is the deadline. And it is very important that you reach out to your friends, your family, to make sure that the census gets filled out, because that will mean a lot to this community and bring resources. Also, there is time to register for more exciting annual event week activities on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Please check out the rest of the series at www.clevelandfoundation.org/annual meeting. Thank you again for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.